The first time your income jumps to a level you're not used to, something strange can happen. The numbers look good. The business appears to be working. From the outside, it might even look like things are finally clicking into place. But internally, something feels slightly unfamiliar. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. And when that happens, the tension doesn't show up in your bank account. It shows up in your decisions. One of the first places I noticed it was in how I evaluated opportunities. Earlier in the journey, most decisions felt obvious. If a client or project increased income, the answer was usually yes. The business was still expanding, and the goal was simple: keep momentum moving. But when income crosses certain thresholds, the decisions stop being that straightforward. More revenue stops being the only variable. Suddenly, you start asking different questions. Does this actually fit the system? Will this create complexity I don't want later? Is the short-term gain worth the structural weight it might add? Those questions don't usually appear until your income system starts entering a new phase. When income grows beyond your old reference points, the rules that guided your earlier decisions start to feel incomplete. What makes this shift uncomfortable is that your instincts were trained under a completely different set of constraints. For a long time, the business required urgency. Growth required speed. Opportunities were scarce enough that saying yes felt like the safest move. That pattern becomes deeply wired. So when income starts to stabilize at a higher level, the internal urgency often doesn't disappear right away. The nervous system still behaves as if the business is fragile, even when the structure underneath has become stronger. I remember a period where the business had reached a healthier income baseline than it ever had before. But my decision-making still carried the habits of the earlier phase. I was reacting to opportunities with the same urgency I had when every new client mattered for survival. It took a while to realize that the system had outgrown that mindset. If your income system matures but your operating instincts don't evolve with it, the business starts carrying unnecessary pressure. This is one of the quieter transitions entrepreneurs experience as their systems grow. The business begins to require a different kind of leadership than it did in the early stage. In the beginning, the role is builder. You create movement. You generate demand. You prove that the system can produce income at all. But later, the role gradually shifts towards something else. You begin protecting the architecture that now exists. You start noticing which kinds of growth strengthen the system and which ones quietly destabilize it. That transition doesn't always feel natural, because for a long time, progress was measured by how much income you could add each month. When that pattern becomes familiar, slowing down long enough to evaluate structural impact can feel almost uncomfortable. I had to learn to pause more often than I expected. Not to stop growth, but to understand what kind of growth the system could actually absorb without creating unnecessary weight. Higher income levels often demand slower, more deliberate decisions, even though the opportunities appear to move faster. Another place this identity shift shows up is in how you interpret stability. Early in the journey, stable income feels like the ultimate goal. Once the business consistently produces revenue, you assume the hard part is finished. But once the system reaches that point, the real work changes rather than disappearing. Now the question becomes whether the structure underneath that income is durable. Is the system dependent on constant motion, or can it hold itself steady for a while? Can you step away without everything slowing down? Does growth add clarity or complexity? Those questions rarely appear when the business is still fighting for traction. They emerge later when income begins to feel more reliable. That's when identity shifts become unavoidable. The mindset that helped you build the system is not always the mindset that helped you stabilize it. This realization took longer than I expected to sink in. For a while, I assumed that the same instincts that created growth would naturally maintain it. But operating a system that already works requires a different rhythm than building one from scratch. Builders are rewarded for urgency. Operators are rewarded for clarity. And if the income system is growing properly, the role eventually begins to move from one to the other. I remember noticing this during a stretch where revenue had settled into a healthier baseline than it ever had before. Instead of chasing every possible expansion opportunity, I found myself paying more attention to the system's internal balance. Which parts were becoming lighter? Which parts were still dependent on constant input? Which decisions strengthened the structure for the long term? Those questions didn't slow growth. If anything, they made it cleaner. When your identity catches up to your income system, growth starts feeling less chaotic and more intentional. That's the turning point many entrepreneurs quietly reach after their systems mature beyond the early stage. The business stops being something you are constantly trying to prove. It becomes something you are actively shaping. Income still matters. Expansion still matters. But the way you pursue it becomes more deliberate. And that shift often begins with a simple realization. The business may have already grown into a stronger system than the identity that originally built it. Once you recognize that, the next phase becomes much clearer. Not because the path suddenly gets easier, but because the way you relate to the system starts evolving with the income it produces. And that's when the business begins to feel less like something you are trying to keep alive and more like something you are intentionally designing for the long run.